well, I can tell you what I enjoyed about your talk, Phil, is that when you had a question about schizophrenia, you actually asked people with schizophrenia what the answer to the question was, and you figured out a way to ask them so that you could believe what they said, and then you believed it. It was great. So the Maltz Prize that we'll hear from, the Maltz Prize winner we'll hear from in just a minute, the Maltz Prize is determined by the Lieber Award, and that Dr. Harvey got to pick the person who received the Maltz Prize. It's no surprise that he picked Dr. Amy Pinkham, who will be our next speaker. So Amy was educated by David Penn in University of North Carolina, and then she went to the Gur's lab, Raquel and Ruben Gur, who also have won the Lieber Prize before. And she, throughout her whole learning career, well, she learned a lot, but her focus was on social cognition, and she has maintained a focus on social cognition ever since. If you keep a focus throughout your whole career so far, I should say that she started out her academic career at SMU in Dallas, and then she's moved on to UT Dallas, University of Texas at Dallas, and she's been assistant associate and now full professor at UT Dallas in Dallas, Texas. And she's kept her focus and her total scientific focus on social cognition. Not only has she kept her focus on social cognition, her science is social as well. She has a lot of collaborators all throughout the country, has continued collaborating with Dr. Harvey, and a lot of collaborators collaborate with her. So if you look at her CV, it will be her own first and last author papers, but then quite a number of papers where she's collaborating with her friends and broadens her own scientists doing the same thing. She develops, we'll hear about her developing biologic constructs based on her understanding of social cognition. With that, I'll introduce you, Amy. This may be a little tricky. I'm sure you can figure it out.
I'll try. Excellent. Well, good morning, everyone. Carol, thank you for that lovely introduction. I want to thank all of you who are here and everyone who's joining virtually for being with us this morning. And before I get started, I do want to take just a quick second to thank Phil for selecting me for this prize, and also the Scientific Council for approving that nomination. This is a tremendous honor, and I am thrilled for the opportunity to be here to share some of my work with you all today. So just to start with some of the important details, I have no disclosures or potential conflicts of interest that I need to report, but I would like to gratefully note that the work that I'll be presenting today has been funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, and I have, of course, these are collaborative efforts. I have many collaborators who have helped to make all this possible, but I want to specifically acknowledge Phil, David Penn, and Colin Depp, who have been key collaborators of mine. Okay, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about social difficulties and social cognition in schizophrenia. Starting with social difficulties, we tend to see that even when individuals with schizophrenia spectrum disorders or SSDs are on an optimal regimen of medication, they still experience significant difficulties within the social realm. And when we ask people about treatment needs, they identify psychosocial difficulties, so things like developing and maintaining relationships as their #1 unmet treatment need. And so this is where I've focused my work, and I have tried to figure out what might be contributing to the social difficulties that seem so persistent in this illness. And what I hope to communicate with you today is that social cognition seems to be one of those important contributors. So social cognition was defined by a National Institute of Mental Health workshop as the mental operations underlying social interactions, including perceiving, interpreting, and generating responses to the intentions, dispositions, and behaviors of others. It's a very big definition. Essentially what it means is that it's how we think about and understand other people. And what I have tried to do is to understand how that's relevant in schizophrenia. I'm going to explain just a little bit more about social cognition before we get into the why it's important part. Social cognition is conceived of as a multidimensional construct composed of several domains. The first domain is emotion processing, and it has both a lower and a higher level. At the lower level, this just refers to recognizing emotion. So I can show you all an image like this and ask, what emotion is this woman experiencing? And most of you will be able to tell me it's something negative, right? Anger, and you would be correct. At the higher level, using emotions includes regulating and managing your emotions to facilitate your functioning. And then we also have social perception. This is the ability to decode and interpret social cues. So we could take a look at this guy and realize that he's telling us to hurry up, right? That's a normal social cognitive process. We also have theory of mind or mentalizing. This refers to the ability to know what somebody else might be thinking or intending. We can take a look at this guy and infer that maybe he needs a little help ironing his shirt or he doesn't know what he's doing. And that would be knowing his mental state. And then finally, we have attributional style or bias, and this refers to how individuals explain the causes of social events. This is one of my favorite examples. It says, sorry, I assumed you were dead because you didn't text me back. Obviously, there are many reasons why someone might not text us back. Some of them are more benign than others, but based on what we think that reason is, it's going to impact our next steps and our behavioral choices. So we see that being relevant in terms of function. And so now that we know what social cognition is, we can ask, why is this relevant in schizophrenia spectrum disorders? And starting at the most basic level, what we see is that for individuals who have been diagnosed and who are within what we would call a chronic phase of illness, shown here in the dark green bars, we see that they perform significantly below healthy individuals on many of our social cognitive tasks. And they show impairments of about 1 standard deviation on emotion processing, social perception, and mentalizing. With attributions, there's a little more variability, but generally speaking, we see significant impairments here. And if we look at individuals who are at clinical high risk for developing psychosis, so they've not yet been diagnosed, but they are either at genetic or at clinical risk, they show impairments of about half of a standard deviation. So we see impairments within all of these different domains. And probably more importantly, what we have seen across a number of studies, and here I'm going to focus just on work that I and my collaborators have done, but what we see is that poor social cognition is related to important real-world outcomes. We see that poor social cognition is related to poor social skill, reduced functional capacity, poor real-world function, reduced life engagement, increased loneliness, decreased employment status, and reports of having fewer enjoyable social interactions. So across a very broad swath of literature, we see that social cognition is important for social function. And when we do a network analysis that looks at the contributions of multiple predictors simultaneously, we see that social cognition, which is shown here in the orange circles, is densely connected to functional capacity and social skills, and those relationships remain even when we control for cognitive ability and symptoms. So social cognition seems to be an important predictor even when we think about some of the other things that are going on within this illness. And we also see that social cognition is linked to a very important and concrete outcome in psychosis, which is suicidality. So 1 out of 20 individuals with psychosis will die from suicide, and between 1/4 to half of individuals with psychosis will attempt suicide at some point in their lives. So despite these numbers, we still know relatively little about what contributes to suicidality and psychosis. But in our work, we've started to see that social cognition seems to be related to factors that we know are definitively related to suicidality. Here's an example of work where we looked at social cognitive performance in individuals with SSDs who either had or had not experienced emotional or physical trauma in childhood. And for those who had experienced trauma, shown in the dark green bars, we see that they were much more likely to make hostile and blaming attributions and to show attributional biases relative to individuals who did not experience trauma. So it's showing, again, here some link between known predictors of suicidality and social cognition, but we do also see links between social cognition and suicidality directly. Here we had a large sample of individuals with SSDs, and we divided it into individuals who were currently experiencing suicidal ideation and individuals who were not experiencing suicidal ideation, and gave them a large battery of social cognitive assessments. And what we see is that our individuals who were currently experiencing suicidal ideation did continue to show more of those blaming and hostile attributions. They were also better at recognizing negative emotions, and they rated more faces as untrustworthy and potentially threatening. So we see these links, and what was most important here is that in this study we also found that this tendency to make the blaming and hostile attributions was linked prospectively to suicidal ideation at 2 weeks. So it was a significant predictor across time as well as cross-sectionally. Okay, and so it's this link between social cognition and social functioning that has also prompted me in my work to try to understand what might be contributing to the social cognitive impairments themselves. And I have focused on a potential neural basis. This illustration shows some of the key neural regions that have been implicated in social cognitive processing, and this is based on the healthy literature. The areas shown in yellow have been linked to emotion and social processing. The areas shown in blue have been linked to mentalizing, and then the areas in green have been linked to both. And generally speaking, what we tend to see is that individuals with SSDs show reduced or abnormal activation in these brain regions when they are asked to complete a social cognitive task. And the areas that are circled in red are ones that have been highlighted by meta-analyses as being very specifically linked to social cognition and showing very significant impairments in individuals with SSDs. And so what we have looked at, and I'm going to show data from 2 different studies here, is what do these areas look like, again, in individuals with schizophrenia? And I've already kind of given away the punchline here. In both of these studies, we asked individuals to complete social cognitive tasks while undergoing functional neuroimaging. And you can see in both of the voxel-wise analyses that are flanking this screen that individuals with schizophrenia were showing reduced activation relative to healthy controls. On the left, you can see that in amygdala. On the right, you can see it in the rostrolateral prefrontal cortex. But what's more important here is that in both of these studies, we found that the degree of activation within these neural regions was positively and significantly correlated with real-world functioning. So the more activation someone had within these social cognitive regions, the better they were doing out in the real world. And so taken together, the story that I want to communicate this morning is that social cognition seems very relevant for social function in SSDs, and it seems possible that abnormalities at the level of the brain are contributing to some of these behavioral difficulties that then contribute to the functioning difficulties. And so despite all of what we have learned so far, there remain some very significant challenges in the field related to social cognition, and measurement is one of those. And this is something that I've tried to tackle with David Penn and Phil Harvey. Social cognition is a very broad construct, and there are many, many ways to assess it. And so this has resulted in a proliferation of tasks that are used throughout the research field, some of them with very poor psychometric properties or poor quality, meaning that they're not very reliable, and we're not even sure that they're measuring what we want them to measure, and others with unknown psychometric properties. And so what we have tried to do, well, and I should also say, and initially we also did not have a consensus on how to best assess social cognition. So what we've tried to do is to address those specific challenges. And we've done so through an initiative called the SCOPE study. This was the Social Cognition Psychometric Evaluation Study. Here we started by asking experts within the field to nominate tasks that they thought were suitable for use in clinical trials as outcome measures. And we received nominations for 108 different tasks. So that tells you a little bit about how many are out there. We then windowed this down to 21 and asked a panel of experts to identify the most promising tasks of those 21 that we would then evaluate in a very detailed way to try to assess their reliability and validity. We then, in a subsequent study, did test the reliability and validity of those assessments, and were able to recommend 2 for use immediately. So we started with 108, we got down to 2, and I think that's a good sort of testament to the difficulties related to measurement. From there, we did take some tasks that seemed promising, but didn't quite clear the bar. tested them, made some modifications to those tasks, and then tested them again. And from there, we were able to recommend 3 tasks for use in clinical trials. And just to show an example, some quick examples of 2 of them. One of them is called the University of Pennsylvania Emotion Recognition Task. In it, you just show individuals pictures of someone's face, and they have to tell us what emotion that person is experiencing from 5 choices. So it's very straightforward. Another one is called the hinting task. In this one, we read a brief vignette to our participants and ask them to tell us what the true intent behind a delivered hint is. So here, this one says, Paul has to go to an interview and he's running late. While he's cleaning his shoes, he says to his wife, Jane, I want to wear that shirt, but it's very wrinkled. And so we ask, what does Paul want Jane to do? And if participants give an incorrect response, we give a second hint. In this case, Paul goes on to say it's in the ironing basket, and we ask again, what does he want Jane to do? And of course, here he wants her to help iron his shirt. And from this, I'm very happy to say that we're starting to see much more widespread and standardized use of these tasks, which makes it much, much easier to assess replicability across studies and validity of results. Since scope, we have continued to look at measurement issues with a particular eye toward measurement bias. These are some data from a paper published by Arun Nagendra, where she looked at social cognitive performance in Black versus white individuals who have been diagnosed with SSDs, and she found that the white individuals outperformed Black individuals by a significant amount, and we were very curious about why this might be the case. And we thought that bias within our measurement may be playing a role. And these are some data from a multi-group path analysis where we looked at the impact of race on performance. We did look at this in healthy controls as well as individuals with schizophrenia, although here I'm just showing the schizophrenia data. And what we found was that race was significantly correlated to performance on 2 of our social cognitive tasks. The first one is the BLERT, or the Bell-Lysaker Emotion Recognition Task, and then also the eyes task. And this is a task where you just show people a photograph of the eye region of people's face, and they have to tell you what that person might be thinking from a choice, or rather from a choice of 4 options. And what we found is that for both of these tasks, Caucasian individuals significantly outperformed Black participants. And we started thinking about why that might be the case, and there's a very important caveat about both of these tasks, which is that both of them use only Caucasian stimuli. And there's a well-known phenomenon within the face processing literature referred to as the other race effect, which tells us that we are much better at processing same versus other race faces, and this is thought to develop through expertise with same race faces over time. And so by including only Caucasian stimuli in these tasks, we may be automatically biasing them in favor of our white participants. And what's important here too is that we did not see a relationship between race and the ER40, which is the task I showed previously, that does use diverse stimuli. So I think this highlights the need to continue to think about diversity of stimuli and potential bias within our social cognitive assessments. In terms of other current directions and things that we have done, we have focused on trying to use our information about social cognition to identify novel treatment targets. As Phil explained in his talk, introspective accuracy or self-awareness, we think, is one of those potentially malleable treatment targets. And here within social cognition, what we've found repeatedly is that your self-assessment of your social cognitive performance is actually a better predictor of outcomes than your actual social cognitive performance. So this suggests that if we can improve your self-assessments, we can also improve function, and so that's what we're trying to do now. We have also worked on developing mobile assessments, and so these can be delivered on a smartphone or a tablet. They can be done out in the naturalistic environment, and they can be done repeatedly. This is an example of a mobile emotion recognition task that we've developed, and what it allows us to do is to look at variability in emotion recognition over time and across contexts that we can't do in a normal lab setting. And then finally, I'll just note that we've also argued for the importance of cultural considerations in the assessment of social cognition, and I'm really pleased to say that we now have a formal initiative to support this. It's funded by the Schizophrenia International Research Society and their harmonization effort, and what we're trying to do is to identify tasks that are suitable for use in cross-cultural and transdiagnostic studies. And we hope that within the year, we'll be able to make some recommendations to the field about how we can move forward with cross-cultural assessments. So I know I'm running short on time. I'll wrap up with just 3 main take-home points. First is that social cognition appears to be a critical contributor to social functioning in individuals with schizophrenia. Neural abnormalities also appear to subserve impairments in social cognition and are linked to functional outcomes. And then I'll just end with the idea that measurement of social cognition remains a challenge with continued need for tasks that use diverse and culturally applicable stimuli. As I mentioned at the very beginning, science is collaborative. I have a large network of collaborators to whom I am all very, very grateful. I've listed some of them here. It's possible that I've left some individuals off the list. I apologize if I have. But thank you all for your attention and for being here this morning.
Thank you. Very nice presentation and very important work. But I have a question. Is it state or trait? How stable it is over time? And does it cycle with the symptoms and the symptom severity? And does it respond to medication at all? Or it is just basically refractory?
Yeah, so great question. So I can comment, 2 comments geared towards severity. Michael Green has done some, and Bill Horan have done some great work showing that social cognitive impairments seem to be relatively stable across phases of illness. We do see, of course, greater impairments in individuals who have been chronically ill relative to individuals who are at clinical high risk, as I mentioned, but those clinical high risk samples are quite mixed, right? So some of those individuals are not going to go on to develop the illness, and so that might end up causing what seems like a reduced impairment there. But we do see significant impairments in first episode patients as well as chronic patients. And in terms of do they respond to medication, the preponderance of evidence says no. Pharmacological interventions do not seem to help with social cognitive impairments.
One more question?
Thank you. Much of what you described there it has also been said about autism. And I'm wondering if you looked at that correlation and what conclusions did you come to?
So it's almost like I put you as a plant in the audience. That is a perfect question. So we have actually looked at this in adults with autism. And my husband, who is here today, is an autism researcher, and we have done many comparative studies of adults with schizophrenia and adults with autism. And what we tend to see is that in terms of degree or size of impairment, both individuals with ASD and individuals with schizophrenia look very similar. So they both show impairments relative to healthy individuals, but they show relatively few differences as compared to one another. Where it does seem to be a little bit different is that we see these strong correlations between social cognition and social functioning in schizophrenia, but that relationship seems to be reduced in autism. And so we have lots of ideas about why that might be the case, but the social cognitive impairments don't seem to be quite as predictive of functioning in autism as they are in schizophrenia.
You mentioned the why, but could you address why is this happening in both groups? Is it something that the brain is happening in both?
So again, a great question. So my dissertation, which was actually funded in part by BBRF, was a neuroimaging comparison study of autism and schizophrenia during social cognitive processing. And we found very similar neural deactivations or decreases in activation between the individuals with ASD and individuals with schizophrenia. Now, I'm not going to say that they have similar pathways because developmentally these disorders sort of manifest in very different ways, and there's lots of opportunity for other things to come in and to contribute to the equifinality that we see. But we do think there are some overlapping mechanisms and then some that clearly diverge, and that's a topic that we continue to do research on. So, yeah, we're trying.
Can I ask?
One more question.
Yeah, one more. I have a question about the brain scans that you showed, and ultimately they reduced to 2 areas of, I guess, underactivation or overactivation?
Underactivation for our individuals with SSD, yep.
So I'm assuming that my take from that is overly reductive and not helpful, but let me ask you anyway.
Sure.
Is it overly reductive to just think that stimulation of those areas could improve the symptom? Or it's such a complex pathway that leads to that activation signal that that's just not, it's not realistic?
So that is not overly simplistic at all, and that has been tried with mixed results so far. And I think part of the things that contribute to those mixed results are that there are many different ways to stimulate the brain. We can use different types of transcranial direct current stimulation. We can do it for different durations. We can do it repeatedly or in single sessions. There have been a few studies that seem to suggest that sometimes that might help, or that we might be able to get some positive results, but there are also some failed studies as well. So I think we're still just too early to know for sure whether or not that works, but there are definitely people that are trying it. We've tried it in my own lab. We unfortunately were one of those studies that failed to find a significant effect, but we do think brain stimulation is a promising avenue for improving social cognitive impairments, so people are still trying that, and we're also still developing studies to be able to test that in a better and more rigorous ways than we did our first time.
So thank you, Dr. Pinkham.
Yeah, thank
for
you.
a wonderful, wonderful talk.